The mess hall of the starship Harmony's Edge buzzed with conversation as soldiers from 12 different alien species gathered for their evening meal. The massive room stretched across 3 levels, with eating areas designed to accommodate beings of vastly different sizes and dietary needs. Steam rose from various food dispensers, each calibrated to provide nutrition for specific alien physiologies. Jake Morrison sat alone at a corner table, methodically eating his standard human ration pack. The 42-year-old staff sergeant kept to himself most days, preferring solitude to the constant chatter that filled the communal spaces. His weathered face bore the scars of 3 previous wars, and his gray eyes held the distant look of someone who had seen too much combat. The human had been aboard the Coalition vessel for only 2 weeks, assigned as part of the new integration program that mixed species within combat units. Most of the alien soldiers had been curious about their new human squadmate, but Morrison's quiet demeanor had discouraged casual conversation until now. A shadow fell across his table as Zefka approached, followed by 5 other aliens. The Vektari warrior stood nearly 8 feet tall, his scaled hide gleaming under the artificial lights. His species had evolved on a high-gravity world, giving them incredible physical strength and natural armor plating. Zefka considered himself the finest soldier aboard the ship, and his arrogant personality matched his impressive combat record. "Mind if we join you, human?" Zefka asked, though he was already pulling out a chair designed to support his massive frame. Morrison looked up from his meal and nodded silently. The other aliens took this as permission to sit, arranging themselves around the table with obvious curiosity. Besides Zefka, the group included Quelix 7, a Thornian whose species prized intellectual achievement above all else. The thin, pale alien possessed 4 arms and large compound eyes that could process information at superhuman speeds. "We have been wondering about human military customs," Quelix 7 said, his voice carrying the formal tone his species used for all communication. "Your personnel files indicate extensive combat experience, but they lack details about human traditions." Morrison swallowed a bite of reconstituted protein and set down his spoon. "What kind of traditions do you want to know about?" "Battle rituals," offered Crix, a insectoid Mantari whose clicking mandibles created a strange rhythm when she spoke. "My people perform the death dance before each engagement to honor our ancestors." "The Aldari recite the names of glory," added another alien, his blue-tinted skin marking him as a member of that aquatic species. "We speak the names of famous warriors to channel their strength." Morrison considered the question for a moment. "Some human soldiers carry personal items, photos of family, religious symbols, coins from their homeland, small things that remind them what they are fighting for." Zefka's laughter boomed across the mess hall, causing conversations at nearby tables to pause. "You carry trinkets into battle like children with security blankets." The other aliens joined in the laughter, though some seemed more confused than amused. Quelix 7 leaned forward with academic interest. "Are these items believed to possess supernatural properties? Do humans think these objects provide actual protection in combat?" "It is not about magic," Morrison replied evenly. "It is about connection, remembering why the fight matters." "But surely educated humans do not believe in such superstitions," pressed Quelix 7. "Your species has developed faster than light travel and energy weapons. How can you simultaneously embrace primitive thinking?" Morrison's expression remained neutral, but those who looked closely might have noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. "Human traditions go back thousands of years. Warriors have always found ways to carry their courage with them." This statement triggered another round of laughter from Zefka. "Courage cannot be carried, human. Either you possess the warrior spirit or you do not. These tokens you describe sound like the desperate attempts of weak soldiers to convince themselves they are brave." "My species conquered our homeworld through superior intellect," Quelix 7 added with obvious pride. "We developed advanced tactical systems that eliminated the need for emotional manipulation. Logic and calculated strategy determine victory, not mystical thinking." Morrison picked up his water container and took a slow sip before responding. "Human history is full of warriors who never retreated, soldiers who held impossible positions against overwhelming odds. People who fought beyond what should have been possible. Ghost stories, Zefka dismissed with a wave of his massive hand. Every species has legends about ancient heroes. These tales grow larger with each telling until truth becomes mythology. The Spartans at Thermopylae held a mountain pass against a Persian army 50 times their size. Morrison continued quietly. 300 warriors against 15,000 soldiers, plus support troops and auxiliaries. Quelix 7's compound eyes flickered as he accessed his internal database. I find no record of this engagement in galactic military archives. It happened on Earth 2,500 years ago. The Spartans knew they would die, but they bought time for their people to prepare defenses. King Leonidas told his men to eat a good breakfast because they would dine in the underworld that night. The aliens exchanged glances that mixed amusement with bewilderment. Crix clicked her mandibles thoughtfully. Your ancestors fought with primitive weapons against primitive enemies. How does ancient history relate to modern warfare? The weapons change, Morrison said. The warrior does not. Zefka slammed his fist on the table, causing several containers to jump. This is exactly what I mean. Humans cling to outdated concepts that have no place in contemporary combat. Your species lacks the physical advantages of the Vectari or the intellectual superiority of the Thornians, so you compensate with fantasy stories about magical warriors. There is nothing magical about training, discipline, and the will to complete the mission, Morrison replied. But you are right about one thing. Humans are not the strongest or smartest species in the galaxy. Finally, some honesty, Quelix 7 said with satisfaction. Morrison finished the last of his rations and began cleaning his eating utensils with methodical care. There is an old human saying, it is not the size of the dog in the fight, but the size of the fight in the dog. The mess hall seemed to explode with alien laughter. Zefka nearly fell backward from his chair, his booming voice drowning out the others. Several aliens at nearby tables turned to see what was causing the commotion. Dogs. Quelix 7 managed between fits of intellectual amusement. Humans compare themselves to domesticated animals and somehow find this inspiring. Your mythology becomes more primitive with each example, Zefka wheezed. First ancient warriors with bronze weapons, now household pets. What wisdom will you share next, human? Perhaps the combat techniques of earth insects. Morrison stood and gathered his eating gear, his movements calm and controlled. The laughter continued around him as he prepared to leave the table. Where are you going? Crix called out. We were just beginning to understand human military philosophy. I have equipment to maintain, Morrison said simply. Of course you do, Zefka said with mock solemnity. I am sure your trinkets and good luck charms require careful attention. Morrison walked away without responding, leaving the aliens to continue their discussion of human superstition and primitive thinking. As he reached the mess hall exit, he heard Quelix 7 launching into a lecture about the evolutionary advantages of logical thinking over emotional attachment. The staff sergeant made his way through the ship's corridors toward his quarters, passing other coalition soldiers who nodded respectfully at his rank insignia. Morrison had served alongside dozens of alien species during his military career, and he had learned that first impressions rarely told the complete story. As he entered his small cabin, Morrison looked at the single personal item displayed on his desk. It was a simple military challenge coin, worn smooth by decades of handling. The coin bore the emblem of his first unit, where he had learned the true meaning of brotherhood and sacrifice. Morrison picked up the coin and turned it over in his fingers, remembering the faces of soldiers who had carried similar tokens into their final battles. These men and women had not died for superstition or primitive mythology. They had died because someone had to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. The human placed the coin back on his desk and began cleaning his service weapon, a ritual he had performed thousands of times before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges aboard the Harmony's Edge, and Morrison suspected his alien squad mates would have more opportunities to test their theories about human weakness. He would be ready when that time came. The emergency klaxons began wailing at 0347 ship time, jolting every soldier aboard the Harmony's Edge from their sleep. Red warning lights bathed the corridors as personnel rushed to their assigned stations. Jake Morrison had been awake for an hour already, maintaining his weapon in the quiet darkness of his quarters when the alarm sounded. Within minutes, the ship's communication system crackled to life with Commander Yethnal's authoritative voice. The Aldari officer's words carried the weight of urgent command as he ordered all combat personnel to report to the main briefing hall. Immediately, Morrison made his way through corridors, filled with hurrying soldiers from a dozen different species. The organized chaos reminded him of similar emergencies during his previous deployments, though the mix of alien faces and forms still struck him as surreal after weeks aboard the Coalition vessel. The briefing hall buzzed, with nervous energy as over 200 soldiers filed into the amphitheater-style seating. Morrison found a spot near the back, preferring to observe rather than engage with his squadmates. He noticed Zefka holding court near the front, regaling other Vectari warriors with what appeared to be another story about human inadequacy. Commander Yethnal strode onto the raised platform at the front of the hall, his blue-scaled skin gleaming under the harsh lights. The Aldari stood nearly 7 feet tall, with the natural authority that came from decades of military leadership. Behind him, a massive holographic display flickered to life, showing a 3-dimensional map of a star system. "We have received a priority distress signal from the mining colony of Kepler 442b. The commander began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's acoustics. "The Krex Empire has launched a surprise assault on the Outer Rim colonies." A collective murmur ran through the assembled soldiers. The Krex had been quiet for months, leading many to believe they were consolidating their forces after recent defeats. This sudden offensive caught the Coalition completely off guard. The holographic display zoomed in to show a rocky planet with extensive surface installations. Red markers indicated enemy positions while blue dots represented colonial settlements. Even from a distance, Morrison could see that the red markers vastly outnumbered the blue ones. "Intelligence reports indicate a full Krex battle group has made planetfall," Commander Yethnal continued. "Over 3,000 elite shock troopers with heavy armor support. The colony's defensive forces were overwhelmed within hours of the initial assault." Quelix 7 raised one of his forearms to request permission to speak. "What is our mission objective, Commander? Surely we cannot engage 3,000 enemy soldiers with our current force strength." "The colony houses 50,000 civilian inhabitants," the commander replied grimly. "Our mission is evacuation and tactical withdrawal. We must extract as many civilians as possible before Krex reinforcements arrive." The tactical situation appeared hopeless even to Morrison's experienced eye. 200 Coalition soldiers against 3,000 Krex veterans represented odds that no amount of superior training could overcome. The mission would require perfect timing, flawless coordination, and more than a little luck. The colony's main settlement is built around 3 primary extraction sites, Commander Yethnal explained as the display highlighted key locations. "We will establish evacuation zones at each site and conduct a fighting retreat to buy time for civilian transport." Morrison studied the terrain carefully, noting choke points, defensive positions, and likely enemy approach routes. His tactical mind automatically began calculating firing lines, supply routes, and fallback positions. Old habits formed during decades of combat experience guided his analysis. "The most critical target is the colony's power station," the commander continued. "This facility controls the settlement's defensive shields, communication arrays, and transportation systems. If the Krex capture it intact, they can prevent any evacuation attempts." A new image appeared on the display, showing a massive complex built into the side of a mountain. The power station looked like a fortress with heavy walls and limited access routes. Morrison recognized it as both a defensive advantage and a potential trap. "We need volunteers for a diversionary mission," Commander Yethnal announced. "A small force will hold the power station to deny it to the enemy and buy time for the main evacuation effort." The hall fell silent. Everyone present understood what kind of mission this represented. Whoever volunteered for the power station assignment would face impossible odds with little chance of survival. It was a suicide mission disguised as a tactical necessity. Morrison stood up slowly, his movement drawing attention from soldiers throughout the hall. "I volunteer for the diversionary force." Zefka turned in his seat to stare at the human with obvious disbelief. "This is madness, Morrison. The power station cannot be held against such overwhelming numbers." "Someone has to try," Morrison replied calmly. 50,000 civilians deserve that chance." Quelix 7's compound eyes flickered as he processed tactical calculations. "The position is mathematically indefensible, Any force assigned to hold it will be destroyed within hours of enemy contact. Then we make those hours count, Morrison said. Commander Yethnal looked at Morrison with something approaching respect. Staff Sergeant Morrison, you understand the nature of this assignment. The power station will be the primary target for Krek's forces. They will throw everything they have at that position. I understand, sir. Very well. Morrison, you have command of the diversionary force. Who will volunteer to serve under him? The hall remained quiet for several uncomfortable seconds. Finally, a young Mantari soldier named Clickvess raised her hand. I will serve with the human. One by one, other soldiers began volunteering. Some appeared motivated by genuine courage, while others seemed driven by curiosity about Morrison's leadership abilities. To everyone's surprise, Zefka eventually stood and announced his intention to join the diversionary force. I will not let it be said that a human showed more courage than a Vektari warrior, he declared, loudly. Quellex 7 also volunteered, though his reasons seemed more analytical than heroic. This mission presents unique tactical challenges. I wish to observe human command methods under extreme stress. Within minutes, Morrison had 20 volunteers representing 6 different species. Commander Yethnal looked pleased with the response, though Morrison suspected the Aldari officer had little hope for their mission's success. The diversionary force will deploy immediately, the commander announced. Transportation to the surface launches in 30 minutes. All other personnel will prepare for the main evacuation operation. As soldiers filed out of the briefing hall, Morrison found himself surrounded by his new squad. Most looked nervous but determined, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them on Kepler 442b. However, he could hear whispered conversations among the alien soldiers that revealed their continued doubts about human leadership. I hope Morrison's legendary human warriors can help us now, Zefka said loud enough for others to hear. Perhaps he can summon ancient spirits to fight alongside us. Maybe his good luck charms will deflect enemy weapons, added another Vektari with obvious sarcasm. Quellex 7 approached Morrison directly as the group made their way toward the deployment bays. Staff Sergeant, what is your tactical assessment of our chances for success? Morrison considered the question carefully before responding. We are not going to win this fight through superior firepower or numbers, but winning is not always about destroying the enemy. What do you mean? The Thornian asked. Sometimes victory means buying enough time for others to complete their mission. Sometimes it means making the enemy pay such a high price that they hesitate before their next attack. You speak of sacrifice as if it were a tactical advantage, Quellex 7 observed. For humans, sometimes it is. The deployment bay filled with activity as soldiers prepared their equipment and checked their weapons. Morrison moved among his volunteers, ensuring everyone understood their roles and responsibilities. He noticed that several aliens continued, making jokes about human superstitions and mythological thinking. Do you think Morrison will perform some ancient ritual before we deploy? One soldier whispered to another, maybe. He will tell us stories about magical warriors to boost our morale, came the reply. Morrison ignored the comments and focused on the mission ahead. In a few hours, these same soldiers would see exactly what human mythology really meant. They would learn the difference between stories told for entertainment and principles worth dying for. As the transport ship prepared for launch, Morrison checked his personal equipment one final time. The challenge coin remained in his chest pocket, worn smooth by generations of soldiers who had carried it into impossible battles. The coin was not a good luck charm or mystical talisman. It was a reminder of what humans became when everything else fell away except duty, honor, and the will to protect those who could not protect themselves. Soon his alien squad mates would understand the difference. The transport ship touched down on Kepler 442b, just as the first light of dawn painted the rocky landscape in shades of orange and red. Morrison's diversionary force had 3 hours to reach the power station and establish defensive positions before the main Krek's assault began. The power station loomed ahead like an ancient fortress, its massive concrete walls built directly into the mountainside. 3 access roads wound up the steep terrain, each wide enough for heavy vehicles and large troop formations. Morrison could see immediately why the facility was so strategically important and why holding it would be nearly impossible. Spread out and take cover, Morrison ordered as his 20 volunteers disembarked from their transport. We need to reach the facility before enemy scouts spot us. The mixed group of alien soldiers moved across the barren ground with varying degrees of tactical awareness. Some, like the Vektari warriors, advanced with natural stealth despite their size. Others, including several Thornian technicians, struggled with the basic concepts of cover and concealment. Morrison led from the front, his experienced eyes constantly scanning for threats while his mind cataloged defensive possibilities. The terrain offered some natural advantages, with rocky outcroppings and steep slopes that could channel enemy advances into predictable patterns. "This position is completely indefensible," Zefka announced as they reached the power station's outer perimeter. "Any competent military force could overrun these walls within minutes." "Then we do not rely solely on the walls," Morrison replied, already moving toward the facility's main entrance. Inside the power station, Morrison began his inspection with methodical thoroughness. The facility consisted of multiple levels connected by maintenance corridors, service tunnels, and emergency passages. Massive generators hummed in the lower levels while control rooms occupied the upper floors. "Quelix 7, I need you to map all the internal passages," Morrison ordered. "Clickves, check the ammunition stores and see what heavy weapons are available. Zefka, take your warriors and scout the 3 approach roads." The aliens exchanged glances but followed his orders. Morrison's calm authority impressed them despite their continued doubts about human tactical abilities. They had expected emotional speeches or mystical rituals, not practical military preparation. Morrison spent the next hour positioning defensive elements with surgical precision. He placed automatic weapons to create interlocking fields of fire that would force attackers into kill zones. Heavy barriers were repositioned to provide cover while maintaining clear shooting lanes. Emergency supplies were distributed to multiple locations in case sections of the facility became isolated. "You seem to know exactly what you are doing," Quelix 7 observed as he returned from mapping the internal layout. "These preparations follow established defensive doctrine from multiple military traditions. Humans have been defending fixed positions for thousands of years," Morrison replied while adjusting a weapon mount. "The principles do not change much." Zefka returned from his reconnaissance with troubling news. "Enemy scouts are already moving up the access roads. I count at least 50 vehicles in the initial wave, probably 500 soldiers. Just the advance guard," Morrison said without looking up from his work. "The main assault will be much larger." "We should withdraw immediately," one of the Thornian soldiers suggested nervously. "These odds are mathematically impossible to overcome." "No withdrawal," Morrison stated firmly. "We hold this position for as long as possible." The alien soldiers looked at each other with growing concern. Several began whispering about human stubbornness and the irrationality of hopeless last stands. They had volunteered for this mission expecting some clever tactical innovation from their human commander, not a suicidal defense against overwhelming odds. "Morrison, you must see reason," Zefka argued. "My people honor courage, but this is not courage. This is senseless waste of life." Morrison finally stopped his preparations and looked directly at the Vektari warrior. "What is your understanding of courage, Zefka?" "Courage is facing danger without fear, fighting against reasonable odds to achieve victory." "That is not courage," Morrison replied quietly. "That is just good tactics. Courage is doing what must be done even when victory is impossible." Before anyone could respond, the facility's sensors detected the approaching Krex forces. Morrison moved to the main observation post and surveyed the enemy formation through high-powered optics. What he saw confirmed his worst fears about their tactical situation. The Krex assault force consisted of over 800 elite shock troopers supported by heavy armor and air support. These were not ordinary soldiers, but the finest warriors the enemy empire could field. Their black armor gleamed in the morning sunlight as they advanced in perfect formation up the 3 access roads. 500 soldiers, Morrison announced calmly. "First wave only. Main assault will follow within the hour." Several alien soldiers moved to the observation windows and stared at the approaching enemy with obvious fear. The sheer size of the Krex force made their defensive preparations seem pathetically inadequate. "We cannot possibly hold against such numbers," Clickves said, her mandibles clicking nervously. "Perhaps we should signal for immediate evacuation." "No signals," Morrison ordered. "Radio silence until the shooting starts." "But this is suicide," protested one of the Mantari soldiers. "We will all die for nothing." Morrison checked his weapon one final time and moved to his assigned firing position. We will die buying time for 50,000 civilians to escape. That is not nothing. The first Krex energy blast struck the power station's outer walls at precisely 0800 hours. The initial bombardment was devastating, designed to break the morale of the defenders before the ground assault began. Chunks of concrete and metal flew through the air as enemy weapons systematically destroyed the facility's external defenses. Morrison's voice cut through the chaos with calm authority. Hold your positions. Do not return fire until they reach the first marker. The alien soldiers crouched behind their barriers, some trembling with fear as the bombardment continued. They had expected Morrison to order an immediate counterattack or attempt some desperate breakthrough. Instead, he waited with inhuman patience as the enemy closed the distance. Now, Morrison commanded when the leading Krex units reached his predetermined firing line. The power station erupted with defensive fire as 20 weapons opened up simultaneously. Morrison had positioned his soldiers to create a devastating crossfire that caught the advancing Krex completely by surprise. The first wave of enemy troops stumbled directly into perfectly coordinated kill zones. For 10 minutes, the defensive fire was so accurate and well coordinated that the Krex assault stalled completely. Enemy soldiers took cover behind rocks and disabled vehicles, unable to advance under the withering defensive barrage. How is this possible? Zefka shouted over the noise of battle. We are outnumbered 20-1, but they cannot advance. Defensive advantage, Morrison replied while engaging targets with methodical precision. Force them to come to us on our terms. The alien soldiers began to realize that their human commander was not relying on luck or mystical thinking. Every defensive position had been chosen for maximum tactical advantage. Every firing lane had been calculated to create the deadliest possible crossfire. Every piece of cover had been positioned to protect the defenders while exposing the attackers. When the first Krex assault finally broke through the outer perimeter, Morrison immediately ordered a fighting withdrawal to the second defensive line. The aliens expected panic and confusion, but instead found themselves moving through a carefully planned retreat that maintained unit cohesion while inflicting maximum casualties on the pursuing enemy. Secondary positions, Morrison called out as his soldiers reached the inner defensive ring. Same drill, hold until my command. The second Krex assault wave had learned from the first attack's failure. They advanced more cautiously, using cover effectively and coordinating their movements with professional skill. But Morrison had anticipated this tactical evolution and prepared accordingly. Flanking maneuver on the left, Quelix 7 reported from his observation post. 50 enemy soldiers moving through the maintenance tunnels. Click Vest, take 3 soldiers and seal those tunnels, Morrison ordered without hesitation. Use the explosive charges we positioned earlier. The Mantari soldier moved immediately to carry out his orders. Within minutes, a series of controlled explosions collapsed key sections of the tunnel system, trapping the flanking force underground and forcing the main Krex assault to continue their frontal attack. By midday, Morrison's small force had repelled 4 separate Krex assaults while inflicting over 300 enemy casualties. The alien soldiers who had volunteered for this mission began to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The enemy should have overrun us hours ago, Quelix 7 said during a brief lull in the fighting. According to all tactical calculations, this defense should have collapsed immediately. Morrison reloaded his weapon and checked his remaining ammunition supply. Calculations do not account for human stubbornness. This is not stubbornness, Zefka said with growing respect. This is something I have never seen before. As the afternoon wore on, Morrison continued to extract his force. The 5th Krex assault began at 1400 hours with a bombardment that shook the entire mountain. Enemy forces had brought up siege weapons capable of punching through the power station's reinforced walls, and the defensive positions that had served Morrison so well were crumbling under the relentless barrage. Morrison's force had been reduced to 12 effective soldiers. 8 of his volunteers lay dead in the outer defensive rings, their bodies testament to the morning's desperate fighting. The survivors huddled in the facility's central control room, surrounded by the massive blast doors that represented their final line of defense. Ammunition report, Morrison called out as debris rained down from another near miss. 3 magazines remaining, Zefka reported, his earlier arrogance replaced by grim determination. Most of the heavy weapons are destroyed or out of ammunition. Medical supplies are exhausted, added Clickvess. her voice strained from treating wounded throughout the long battle. Two soldiers need immediate evacuation, but there is nowhere to go. Morrison surveyed his remaining squad with tactical assessment rather than emotional reaction. Quelix 7 had taken shrapnel to 2 of his forearms but continued operating the facility's sensor systems. A young Aldari soldier named Bluefin sat propped against a wall, pressing a field dressing against a serious chest wound. The others showed various degrees of injury and exhaustion. The blast doors will not hold much longer, Quelix 7 reported from his monitoring station. Enemy siege weapons are designed specifically for breaching fortified positions like this. How long? Morrison asked. Perhaps 30 minutes if we are fortunate. The Kreks are methodical in their approach, but they have overwhelming firepower. Morrison moved to the facility's main control panel and began accessing the power station's primary systems. His fingers worked with practiced efficiency across controls that most soldiers would not understand. But his engineering background from earlier military service served him well. "What are you doing?" Zefka asked, moving closer to observe Morrison's actions. "Preparing our final option," Morrison replied without looking up from the control display. The Vektari warrior studied the readings that appeared on Morrison's screen, and his scaled features went pale. "Those are reactor control systems. You are accessing the main power core. The facility's fusion reactor contains enough energy to level several square kilometers," Morrison explained calmly. "If we cannot hold this position, we can deny it to the enemy permanently." Several alien soldiers turned to stare at Morrison with expressions of shock and horror. The implications of his statement became clear as they realized what he was suggesting. "You mean to destroy the entire facility?" Clickvest said, her mandibles clicking with agitation. "That would kill everyone inside, including us. And take most of the Kreks assault force with us," Morrison confirmed. "Over 1,000 enemy soldiers are concentrated around this position for their final attack." Quelix 7 abandoned his sensor station and approached Morrison directly. "This is madness. There must be another tactical option we have not considered." "What other option?" Morrison asked, still working at the control panel. "We have 12 soldiers, minimal ammunition, and nowhere to retreat. The enemy has unlimited reinforcements and siege weapons that can breach our defenses within the hour." "We could surrender," suggested the wounded Aldari soldier. "The Kreks sometimes take prisoners for intelligence purposes." Morrison finally turned away from the controls to face his remaining squad. "The Kreks do not take prisoners from units that have inflicted heavy casualties on their forces. They consider it a matter of honor to execute soldiers who have killed too many of their warriors. Then we die fighting," Zefka declared, hefting his weapon despite his obvious exhaustion. "Better to fall in battle than to destroy ourselves like cowards." "This is not cowardice," Morrison replied firmly. "This is denying the enemy a strategic victory while maximizing damage to their combat capability." The blast doors shuddered under another direct hit from Krek's siege weapons. Cracks appeared in the reinforced metal as enemy forces prepared for their final breach. Morrison estimated they had perhaps 20 minutes before Krek shock troopers would pour through the failing barriers. "I need to know now," Morrison said, looking at each surviving soldier in turn. "Who stays for the final stand, and who wants to attempt escape through the maintenance tunnels?" "There are no escape routes," Quelix 7 pointed out. "We sealed most tunnels during the earlier fighting, and the remaining passages lead directly into enemy positions." "Then we all stay," Clickvest said with surprising resolve. "If we are going to die, let it mean something." One by one, the other soldiers voiced their agreement to remain with Morrison for the reactor detonation. Some appeared motivated by courage, others by simple acceptance of their hopeless situation, but all seemed to understand that their sacrifice could serve a greater purpose. "Morrison," Zefka said as the human returned to the reactor controls, "I owe you an apology for my earlier words about human mythology." "What changed your mind?" Morrison asked while programming the detonation sequence. "This morning I thought courage meant winning against reasonable odds. You have shown me something different. You fight not because you can win, but because someone must stand between the innocent and those who would harm them." Morrison paused in his work and looked at the Vektari warrior with genuine respect. "That is exactly right. Human legends are not about magical warriors or impossible victories. They are about ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things when others depended on them." "Tell us about these legends," Clickvest requested. "If we are going to die like human warriors, we should understand what that means." Morrison continued programming the reactor overload while speaking in measured tones. At a place called Thermopylae, 300 Spartan warriors held a mountain pass against the entire Persian army. They knew from the beginning that they would not survive. But their sacrifice bought time for Greece to prepare its defenses. Did they win? Asked Bluefin, his voice weak but interested. They lost the battle and died to the last man, but their sacrifice inspired all of Greece to unite against the Persian invasion. The war was won because those 300 warriors were willing to die for something greater than themselves. Another thunderous impact shook the control room as Krek's siege weapons continued their methodical destruction of the blast doors. Morrison could see daylight through several cracks in the failing barriers. At the Alamo, less than 200 defenders held a mission compound against 3,000 Mexican soldiers. They were offered multiple chances to surrender or escape, but they chose to stay and fight. What happened to them? Quelix 7 asked, though he seemed to already know the answer. They died. Every single defender was killed when the walls were finally breached. But their sacrifice became a rallying cry that motivated Texas to win its independence. Morrison finished the final sequence for the reactor overload and activated a 30-minute countdown timer. The control display showed the fusion core beginning to destabilize in carefully controlled stages that would culminate in a massive explosion. "There is one more story you should hear," Morrison said as he picked up his weapon and moved toward the failing blast doors. During the Korean War, American Marines were surrounded at a place called Chosun Reservoir. Outnumbered 10-1 by Chinese forces in sub-zero temperatures, they were ordered to retreat. "Did they obey the order?" Zefka asked. The commanding officer said they were not retreating. They were advancing in a different direction. Those Marines fought their way through 7 enemy divisions to reach safety, bringing their wounded and their dead with them. The blast doors finally gave way with a screech of tortured metal. Krek's shock troopers prepared to storm through the breach, expecting to find a defeated enemy ready to surrender. Instead, they would face Morrison and 11 alien soldiers who had learned what human mythology really meant. Morrison checked his weapon one final time and looked at his squadmates. "Gentlemen, it has been an honor serving with you. Let us show the Kreks what happens when someone threatens 50,000 innocent civilians." The countdown timer showed 28 minutes remaining as the first enemy soldiers appeared in the breach. Morrison took aim and prepared for humanity's final lesson in the true meaning of courage. The first wave of Krek shock troopers poured through the shattered blast doors, expecting to find broken defenders ready to surrender. Instead, they met concentrated fire from Morrison and his 11 remaining soldiers positioned behind the last defensive barriers in the control room. Morrison's rifle spoke with mechanical precision, each shot finding its target among the advancing enemy forces. Years of combat experience guided his movements as he shifted between firing positions, using the control room's layout to maximum tactical advantage. The confined space that should have favored the attacking Kreks became a killing ground where their superior numbers meant nothing. Zefka fought beside him with newfound understanding of what human courage truly meant. The Vektari warrior no longer sought personal glory or individual recognition. Instead, he focused on protecting his wounded squadmates while supporting Morrison's defensive plan with disciplined fire and movement. "Second wave incoming," Quelix 7 called out from his position at the sensor station. Despite his injuries, the Thornian continued providing tactical intelligence that allowed the defenders to anticipate enemy movements. "Estimate 60 additional soldiers moving up the access corridors." Morrison acknowledged the report while reloading his weapon. The reactor countdown timer showed 23 minutes remaining until detonation. Every second they could delay the Krek's advance meant more time for the civilian evacuation and greater enemy casualties. When the facility finally exploded, Klikves had positioned herself near the wounded Eldari soldier, providing covering fire while tending to Bluefin's deteriorating condition. Her earlier nervousness had been replaced by calm determination as she embraced the human concept of fighting for others rather than personal survival. The Kreks adjusted their tactics for the second assault, using coordinated squad movements and suppressive fire to advance through the control room. But Morrison had anticipated this evolution and prepared accordingly. He directed his soldiers to shift positions using predetermined routes that kept them ahead of the enemy advance. "Fall back to position 3, Morrison ordered as Krek's forces began to overwhelm their current defensive line. Maintain crossfire patterns as we move. The alien soldiers moved with precision that would have seemed impossible hours earlier. Morrison's leadership had transformed a group of individual fighters into a cohesive military unit that functioned with deadly efficiency despite overwhelming odds. As they established their new firing positions, Morrison's communication device crackled with an incoming message from Commander Yethnal aboard the Harmony's Edge. The transmission was weak and filled with static, but the words came through clearly enough to understand. "Morrison, this is Command. Report your status immediately." Morrison activated his transmitter while continuing to engage enemy targets. "Control room secure for now. Heavy casualties but still operational." "Understood. I have good news, Staff Sergeant. The civilian evacuation is complete. All 50,000 inhabitants have been successfully extracted from the colony." The words hit Morrison like a physical blow. Their mission had succeeded. The desperate defense of the power station had bought exactly the time needed for the evacuation transports to complete their work. 50,000 innocent lives had been saved by the sacrifice of Morrison's diversionary force. "Acknowledged, Command. Glad to hear it. Morrison, we have reinforcements inbound. Hold your position for another 40 minutes and we can extract your remaining personnel." Morrison looked at the reactor countdown timer showing 19 minutes until detonation. There was no way to stop the overload sequence once it had progressed this far. The facility would explode regardless of any rescue attempt, taking everyone inside along with the surrounding Krex forces. "Negative on extraction, Command. Position will be lost within 20 minutes. "Say again, Morrison." "Did you say 20 minutes? Affirmative. Facility will be completely destroyed in 19 minutes. All personnel on site will be lost." The communication channel fell silent for several seconds before Commander Yethnal responded. "Morrison, are you saying what I think you are saying?" "Reactor overload initiated. Facility and surrounding area will be eliminated along with approximately 1,500 enemy soldiers. Mission complete." Morrison could hear other voices in the background of the transmission as the command staff realized what his final message meant. The human staff sergeant had not only completed his impossible mission, but had found a way to inflict devastating casualties on the Krex assault force. "Morrison," Commander Yethnal said, his voice carrying profound respect, "it has been an honor serving with you." "Likewise, sir. Tell Command that humans do not abandon their posts." Morrison ended the transmission and returned his full attention to the battle. The third Krex assault wave was forming up outside the control room, preparing for what they believed would be their final victory. The enemy had no idea that their triumph would last exactly 16 minutes. "They are gathering for a massive coordinated assault," Quellex 7 reported. "All remaining enemy forces are concentrating on this position." "Perfect," Morrison said with grim satisfaction. "Maximum casualties when the reactor goes." Zefka looked at Morrison with something approaching awe. "You planned this from the beginning. The reactor overload was not desperation. It was your primary tactical objective." "I hoped we could hold longer," Morrison admitted. "But the reactor option was always available if needed. Sometimes the best way to win is to make sure the enemy loses more than they gain." The final Krex assault began with overwhelming force as over 300 surviving enemy soldiers stormed the control room simultaneously from multiple directions. Morrison and his remaining squad opened fire with everything they had left, turning the last few minutes into a desperate close-quarters battle. Morrison fought with an intensity that transcended normal human limitations. Every movement was calculated for maximum effect, every shot placed with lethal precision. He seemed to anticipate enemy actions before they occurred, positioning himself to protect his wounded squadmates while maintaining constant pressure on the advancing Krex forces. The alien soldiers who had mocked human mythology hours earlier now fought alongside Morrison with complete understanding of what they had witnessed. They had seen ordinary courage transformed into something extraordinary through absolute commitment to duty and sacrifice for others. Bluefin, despite his severe wounds, continued firing his weapon from his position against the wall. Clickvest stayed beside him, providing covering fire while refusing to abandon the injured Aldari. Quellex 7 fought with calculated precision that matched his intellectual nature, while Zefka displayed warrior skills that finally lived up to his earlier boasts. With 2 minutes remaining on the countdown timer, Morrison realized that only he and Zefka were still fighting. The others had fallen during the savage close-quarters combat. but each had died protecting their squad mates rather than seeking personal survival. "It has been an education serving under your command," Zevka said as he reloaded his weapon for the final time. "You fought like a human warrior," Morrison replied. "The highest compliment he could offer. I will consider that the greatest honor of my military career." The reactor countdown reached its final seconds as Krek's forces overran their position. Morrison and Zevka continued firing until the moment the facility's fusion core reached critical instability and transformed the entire complex into a miniature star. The explosion was visible from orbit, creating a mushroom cloud that rose 20 kilometers into Kepler 442b's atmosphere. When the blast cleared, nothing remained of the power station except a crater filled with molten rock. Nearly 2,000 Krek soldiers had been eliminated in the detonation, effectively ending their offensive capability in this sector. 6 months later, military academies throughout the galaxy added mandatory courses on human tactical philosophy and the concept of strategic sacrifice. The defense of Kepler 442b became required study for all coalition officers, with particular emphasis on Morrison's transformation of a hopeless situation into decisive victory through absolute commitment to mission success. Zevka survived the explosion, found barely alive in the facility's deepest levels by rescue teams 3 days later. He spent the remainder of his military career teaching other soldiers about the human concepts of duty and honor that he had witnessed during those final, desperate hours. The memorial erected on the rebuilt colony bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of what Morrison and his squad had accomplished. It read, "They held the line so others could live. In their sacrifice, we learned that legends are not born from myth, but from the choices ordinary people make when everything depends on them." The final entry in Morrison's military record was written by Commander Yethnal himself. It stated simply, "Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison proved that human mythology is not superstition, but the accumulated wisdom of a species that has learned to transform mortality into immortality through deeds that echo across the ages." Human traditions were no longer mocked aboard coalition vessels. They were studied, respected, and gradually adopted by alien species who had finally learned the true meaning of courage.